And that, class, concludes our theoretical overview of xenobiological defense mechanisms, Professor Zilks Nara announced, her tentacles waving with a flourish that was probably meant to be dramatic, but just looked like a jumble of overcooked noodles having a seizure.
A chorus of relieved sighs echoed through the lecture hall, followed by the rustle of datapads being shoved into bags. The Galactic University's Comparative Xenobiology 101 course was notorious for its mind-numbing lectures on the defensive capabilities of various species across the known universe.
However, Zilks Nara continued, her voice taking on that annoyingly smug tone that made her students want to molt prematurely. Before you all rush off to drown your sorrows in caffeinated beverages and regrettable life choices, I have a special treat for you today. The collective groan that followed could have powered a small starship. Oh, come now, the professor chided, her epidermis flickering through a rainbow of colors that screamed, I'm trying way too hard to be relatable. I promise this will be far more entertaining than my usual lectures. We have a guest speaker today. A ripple of curiosity swept through the room. Guest speakers were rare in Zilks Nara's class, mainly because most sentient beings would rather gargle acid than voluntarily subject themselves to her company for more than 5 minutes. Please welcome Sarah Chen, a human exchange student from the Deathworld Earth, who has graciously agreed to give us a practical demonstration of her species' defensive capabilities. The door at the back of the lecture hall slid open with a pneumatic hiss, and in walked. Well, to be honest, most of the alien students weren't quite sure what they were looking at. The creature that entered was bipedal, with 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head perched atop a worryingly exposed neck. Its skin was a pale pinkish brown, devoid of scales, chitinous plates, or even a proper exoskeleton. Instead, it was covered in some kind of synthetic fabric that did little to hide its alarmingly squishy-looking body. Hi everyone, the human called out, waving one of its upper appendages in what was presumably meant to be a friendly gesture, but looked more like a threat display to half the species present. I'm Sarah. It's great to be here. The students stared in a mixture of fascination and horror. This fragile-looking thing was from a death world. It looked like it would keel over if you breathed on it too hard. Zilks Nara's voice cut through the stunned silence. Sarah here has agreed to demonstrate some basic self-defense techniques common to her species. Now, I know what you're all thinking, that you've finally lost what passes for your mind and invited a walking snack to our class. Thought Glix Bohr, a Xenician student whose natural defense mechanism involved projectile vomiting acid at potential predators. But I assure you, appearances can be deceiving, the professor continued, blissfully unaware of her students' internal monologues. Humans are classified as a Class 12 species on the Galactic Threat Assessment Scale. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Class 12? That put humans in the same category as the notoriously vicious Kree-Lax, a species that had once declared war on the concept of peace itself. Sarah, meanwhile, was busy setting up what looked like a stuffed dummy in the center of the room. The dummy was vaguely humanoid in shape, with limbs that flopped about uselessly and a head that lolled to one side in a way that made several students feel uncomfortably, like they were watching a crime scene in progress. All right, Sarah said, clapping her hands together with a sound that made half the class flinch. Let's start with something simple. This is a basic self-defense move we call a palm strike. She positioned herself in front of the dummy, feet shoulder-width apart, hands raised in what looked like a comically ineffective posture to most of the alien students. The key, Sarah explained, her voice taking on a tone that was part instructor, part stand-up comedian, is to use the heel of your palm to strike upwards, aiming for the nose or chin of your attacker. Like this. With a speed that seemed to defy the laws of physics, at least according to the stunned Flavians in the front row, whose perception of time was roughly a quarter that of a human's, Sarah's hand shot forward. There was a sickening crunch as her palm connected with the dummy's face and its head snapped back with enough force to tear the fabric of its neck. Stuffing exploded from the wound, raining down on the first few rows of students like some grotesque confetti. Several of them screamed. One particularly high-strung Meplon promptly fainted, its gelatinous body melting into a quivering puddle on the floor. Sarah stepped back, looking rather pleased with herself. And that's how you break someone's nose and potentially drive bone fragments into their brain. Any questions?
The silence that followed was so profound you could have heard a pin drop. assuming, of course, that the pin wasn't too terrified to make a sound in the presence of this terrifying Deathworlder.
Professor Zilk's Nara, her tentacles now coiled tightly around her torso in what was either excitement or an instinctive defensive posture, managed to find her voice. Fascinating, truly fascinating. Sarah, could you perhaps demonstrate a less lethal technique? Sarah's laugh echoed through the lecture hall, causing several students to instinctively engage their fight or flight responses. Oh, Professor, that was one of our less lethal techniques. But sure, let's try something a bit more subtle. She turned back to the class, her smile now taking on a predatory edge that made even the carnivorous species present feel like prey. Who wants to learn how to dislocate a joint? The resulting exodus of students fleeing the room was so swift and chaotic that it would have put a stampeding herd of thoraxian wildebeests to shame. Chairs were overturned, bags were abandoned, and more than one student forgot how to use the door and simply phased through the nearest wall in their panic. Within seconds, the only beings left in the room were Sarah, Professor Zilk's Nara, who seemed to be locked in some sort of fascinated paralysis, and Glixbor the Zenitian, who had accidentally glued himself to his seat with his own defensive secretions. Sarah blinked, looking around at the now empty lecture hall. Was it something I said? Glixbor, still struggling to unstick himself, let out a hysterical laugh that sounded more like a deflating balloon having an existential crisis. Something you said? Something you said? You just casually demonstrated how to kill someone with your bare hands and asked if we wanted to learn joint dislocation as if you were offering us candy. Well, yes, Sarah replied, her tone suggesting that this was all perfectly normal and everyone else was being a bit silly. That's just basic self-defense where I'm from. You should see what we teach in advanced classes. The Zenitian's eyes widened to the point where they threatened to pop out of his skull. Advanced classes, he squeaked. Oh, sure, Sarah said, warming to her topic. Pressure points, ground fighting, weapon disarms. Oh, and my personal favorite improvised weapons. Did you know you can turn pretty much anything into a lethal weapon with the right technique? Pens, books, even a rolled-up magazine. Glixbor made a sound that was equal parts fascination and abject terror. But why? Why do you need to know all this? What kind of hellscape do you live in? Sarah laughed again, a sound that was becoming increasingly associated with impending doom in Glixbor's mind. Oh, it's not that bad. Earth's actually quite nice once you get used to the constant threat of death from, well, everything. She paused, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. Although, now that I think about it, maybe that's why we're so into self-defense. When you live on a planet where everything from the weather to the wildlife is trying to kill you, you kind of have to learn how to fight back. Professor Zilk's Nara, who had been silent up until this point, suddenly snapped out of her trance. Fascinating, she exclaimed, her tentacles uncoiling and waving about in what Sarah was beginning to recognize as extreme excitement. Simply fascinating. Sarah, my dear, would you be willing to give a full lecture series on human defensive techniques? Sarah's face lit up like a supernova. Would I? Absolutely. I've got so much more to show you. We haven't even touched on environmental awareness, de-escalation tactics, or how to take down opponents twice your size. Glixbor, who had finally managed to unstick himself from his chair, promptly re-glued himself in sheer panic. Wonderful, Zilk's Nara enthused, either oblivious to or deliberately ignoring the Zenitian's distress. We'll start next week. I'll make sure to book a larger lecture hall, and perhaps invest in some safety equipment. As Sarah began excitedly discussing potential lesson plans with the professor, Glixbor couldn't help but wonder if he could transfer to a nice, safe major like extreme volcanic geology or quantum singularity diving. Meanwhile, word of the Deathworlder defense demonstration spread through the Galactic University like wildfire. By dinner time, the story had grown to epic proportions, with some versions claiming that the human had single-handedly defeated an entire Krelax war party using nothing but a writing utensil and sheer force of will. In the campus cafeteria, a group of students from various species huddled together, discussing the day's events in hushed, reverent tones. I heard she can kill you just by looking at you, funny, whispered a Flutterbean, its delicate wings quivering with a mixture of fear and excitement. That's nothing, countered a Dragorian, its scales rippling in agitation. My roommate's cousin's friend said humans can regenerate lost limbs and survive in the vacuum of space. The quantum shade, its form flickering in and out of reality, chimed in with its own tidbit. I've calculated a 99.9% probability that humans are actually immortal and just pretend to die to make the rest of us feel better. The wild speculation continued, each claim more outlandish than the last, until a familiar voice cut through the chatter. You know, if you're curious about humans, you could just ask one. The group turned as one, coming face to face with Sarah Chen herself, who was standing there with a tray of what appeared to be some kind of nutrient paste. The cafeteria's attempt at accommodating Earth cuisine had been less than successful. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. It was as if time itself had stopped, frozen by the sheer audacity of this Deathworlder to approach them so casually. Then, in a flurry of movement that would have impressed even the most agile of predators, every single student at the table scrambled to make room. Chairs scraped against the floor, trays were hastily shoved aside, and more than one drink was accidentally knocked over in the process. Sarah, looking both amused and slightly confused, took the offered seat. "Thanks," she said, settling in and eyeing her meal with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. "So, what do you want to know about humans?" The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a photon drop. The students exchanged nervous glances, each silently urging the others to be the first to speak. Finally, the Flutterbean gathered its courage. Is it true that you can kill with just a look?" it asked, its voice barely above a whisper. Sarah blinked, then burst out laughing. The sound caused several nearby students to dive under their tables, convinced that this was some sort of auditory attack. Kill with a look? Oh man, I wish. That would make my morning commute so much easier. Sarah chuckled, wiping a tear from her eye. No, that's just a myth. We're tough, sure, but we're not that badass. The Dragorian, emboldened by Sarah's friendly demeanor, decided to ask its own question. What about regenerating limbs, or surviving in space? Ah, now those are interesting, Sarah replied, her tone taking on a more professorial note. We can't regrow entire limbs, but our bodies are pretty good at healing. Cuts, bruises, even broken bones give us enough time, and we'll bounce back. As for space, she paused dramatically, enjoying the way the aliens leaned in, hanging on her every word. We can survive for a short time, but it's not exactly a fun experience. You'd need a proper suit for any extended spacewalks. The quantum shade flickered rapidly, its form betraying its excitement. And immortality, the calculations suggest. Sarah held up a hand, cutting off the being mid-sentence. I'm going to stop you right there, Casper. We're definitely not immortal. We just don't like to stay down when we're knocked down. She leaned back in her chair, a mischievous glint in her eye. But you want to know what's really cool about humans? The aliens nodded eagerly, even those who hadn't been part of the original conversation. By now, a small crowd had gathered around their table, drawn by the unprecedented sight of a Deathworlder casually chatting with normal species. We're adaptable, Sarah said, her voice taking on a tone of pride. Chuck us into pretty much any environment, and we'll find a way to not just survive, but thrive. Desert? We'll build cities. Arctic tundra? No problem, pass the hot cocoa. Deep sea? Strap on a wetsuit and let's go exploring. She gestured around the cafeteria. Hell, look at me now. I'm light years from home, surrounded by species that evolved in conditions that would kill me in seconds, eating. Whatever this is supposed to be. She poked at the nutrient paste with her fork, eliciting a small yelp from the gelatinous mass. And you know what? I'm having the time of my life. The aliens stared at her in awe, their fear slowly being replaced by a grudging respect. Here was a being from a world that, by all accounts, should have produced nothing but savage killing machines. And yet, she was sitting here, joking and chatting, as if they were all old friends. But Sarah continued, her expression growing more serious. There's something else you should know about humans. Something that I think is even more important than our physical abilities. She paused, making eye contact with each of the aliens around her. The tension in the air was palpable, everyone waiting with bated breath, or whatever passed for breath in their respective biologies for this crucial piece of information. We're really good at making friends, Sarah said with a grin. Even with people or aliens who are totally different from us. Especially then, actually. There's nothing we love more than learning about new cultures, trying new foods, hearing new stories. She spread her arms wide, encompassing the entire cafeteria. This right here? This is what humans live for. Connecting with others, building bridges across the stars. Sure, we can fight if we need to, but we'd much rather sit down and share a meal, even if that meal is trying to escape from my plate as we speak. Indeed, the nutrient paste had begun to exhibit signs of sentience and was making a valiant effort to slither off Sarah's tray. She casually corrolled it with her fork, seemingly unfazed. So yeah, we're tough, we're stubborn, we've got a whole bag of tricks when it comes to self-defense, Sarah concluded. But at the end of the day, what makes humans really special is our ability to turn strangers into friends and enemies into allies. She looked around the table, her smile warm and inviting. So, who wants to be friends with a Deathworlder? Hugh, continue the story where you left off. She looked around the table, her smile warm and inviting. So, who wants to be friends with a Deathworlder? For a moment, nobody moved. The aliens looked at each other, then at Sarah, then back at each other. It was as if they were all waiting for someone else to make. Certainly. I'll continue the story from where we left off. She looked around the table, her smile warm and inviting. So, who wants to be friends with a Deathworlder? For a moment, nobody moved. The aliens looked at each other, then at Sarah, then back at each other. It was as if they were all waiting for someone else to make the first move. Then, to everyone's surprise, Glix bore the Zenitian, who had finally managed to glue himself and had been lurking at the edge of the crowd, stepped forward. His gelatinous form quivered with what might have been nervousness, but his eye stalks were fixed determinedly on Sarah. I would like to be friends, he said, his voice wavering only slightly. Even if you did nearly give me a heart attack earlier, or, well, whatever the Zenitian equivalent of a heart attack is, probably some kind of catastrophic cellular decoherence. Sarah's face lit up with genuine delight. Glix bore, I'm so glad you made it out of the lecture hall. I was worried you might be stuck there until the next ice age. She gestured to the empty seat next to her. Come on, join us. And maybe you can explain what exactly a catastrophic cellular decoherence is, because that sounds both terrifying and fascinating. As Glix bore cautiously oozed into the offered seat, it was as if a dam had broken. Suddenly, aliens of all shapes, sizes and states of matter were clamoring to join the table. The flutterbian fluttered over, its wings creating a small whirlwind that sent several napkins flying. The Dragorian slithered closer, its scales shimmering with excitement. Even the quantum shade, which usually preferred to maintain a safe distance from corporeal beings, condensed its form to hover near Sarah's shoulder. I have 17 questions about human biology, the flutterbian chirped, pulling out a notepad that seemed comically large compared to its delicate frame. Only 17, Sarah laughed. Amateur. I've got at least 50 questions about each of you, and that's just for starters. As the group settled in, the initial tension melted away, replaced by a buzz of excited conversation. Sarah found herself at the center of a whirlwind of questions, each more bizarre than the last. Is it true that humans voluntarily ingest neurotoxins for pleasure? Asked a spindly arachnoid, its mandibles clicking nervously. Sarah blinked, then grinned as understanding dawned. Oh, you mean alcohol? Yeah, some of us do. It's not exactly a neurotoxin, more like a fun juice that makes you temporarily stupid. Fascinating, exclaimed the arachnoid, furiously scribbling notes with 3 of its 8 limbs. And this is considered recreational. For some people, sure, Sarah shrugged. Personally, I prefer my recreational activities with a little less chance of waking up in a strange place with a tattoo I don't remember getting. Speaking of which, do any of your species have anything like tattoos? This sparked a whole new round of discussion, with each alien eager to share their culture's body modification practices. The Dragorian proudly displayed its iridescent scale patterns, carefully cultivated over years to display its family lineage. The quantum shade demonstrated its ability to form complex fractal patterns within its misty form, each shape holding deep metaphysical significance. As the conversation flowed, Sarah found herself marveling at the diversity around her. Here she was, a human from Earth, casually chatting with beings that her ancestors couldn't have even imagined in their wildest dreams. And yet, despite their alien nature, she could see familiar emotions in their expressions, or what passed for expressions on their various non-human features: curiosity, excitement, a touch of lingering nervousness, and above all, a genuine desire to connect. You know, she said during a lull in the conversation, back on Earth, we have this old saying, there are no strangers here, only friends you haven't met yet. I always liked that idea, but I never really understood how true it could be until now. Glix bore, who had gradually relaxed to the point where he was no longer instinctively secreting adhesive every time Sarah moved, tilted his eye stalks in a gesture of curiosity. That is a beautiful sentiment, but surely it cannot always be true. Especially given what you showed us earlier about human combat capabilities. Sarah's expression turned thoughtful. You're right. It's not always true. Humans can be dangerous, just like any other species. We've had our share of conflicts, wars, and all the ugly stuff that comes with them. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But I think that's exactly why sayings like that are so important. They remind us of what we can be at our best, beings capable of turning the unknown into the familiar, of building bridges instead of walls. The quantum shade pulsed softly, its voice a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Our historical data suggests that first contact scenarios between disparate species have a high probability of resulting in conflict. And yet, here we are, defying those odds. How do you explain this anomaly? Sarah couldn't help but chuckle. Anomaly? Nah, this is humanity's secret superpower. Sure, we can throw a mean punch if we need to, but our real strength, it's this. She gestured around the table. Building connections, finding common ground, even when it seems impossible. It's what got us through our own troubled history, and it's what's going to carry us to the stars. She leaned in, her voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. Want to know the real reason humans are classified as a Class 12 species? It's not our physical abilities, it's not our adaptability or our survival skills. It's our capacity for empathy, combined with our relentless curiosity. We don't just want to explore the universe, we want to understand it, to connect with every being in it. And let me tell you, that drive, it's a force to be reckoned with. The aliens exchanged glances, a new understanding dawning in their eyes or sensory organs. They had come to this table expecting tales of human ferocity, of the terrifying abilities that had earned them their Deathworlder status. Instead, they were discovering a species whose true power lay not in their capacity for violence, but in their ability to forge bonds across the deepest gulfs of difference. As the conversation continued late into the night, stories were shared, jokes were attempted with varying degrees of success across species lines, and cultural boundaries began to blur. The once feared human Deathworlder was now just Sarah, still impressively tough by most standards, sure, but also funny, kind, and endearingly eager to learn about her new alien friends. By the time the cafeteria staff, a group of amorphous blob creatures who communicated entirely through interpretive dance, began their elaborate closing time performance, something remarkable had happened. The table was no longer divided into human and aliens. They were just a group of students, diverse beyond imagination, but united by their shared curiosity and newfound friendship. As they began to disperse, making plans to meet up again soon, Glixbor approached Sarah one last time. I must confess, he said, his gelatinous form rippling with what she now recognized as excitement rather than fear. When I first saw your demonstration today, I was terrified. I thought humans must be the most fearsome warriors in the galaxy. Sarah raised an eyebrow, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. And now, Glixbor's eye stalks curved in what Sarah had learned was the Zenitian equivalent of a wide grin. Now I think humans might be the most fearsome friends in the galaxy. And that, I believe, is far more impressive. As Sarah watched her new friends depart, some walking, some slithering, some teleporting in and out of reality, she couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. Not in her own abilities, but in the legacy of her species. Humans had indeed come a long way from their Deathworld origins, but they had brought with them not just their strength and their scars, but their capacity for wonder, for kindness, for bridging the unfathomable gaps between worlds. Tomorrow, she knew, she would return to her classes. She would continue to shock and amaze her alien classmates with demonstrations of human abilities. But now those demonstrations would be tempered with something else, a showcase not just of humanity's physical prowess, but of their boundless capacity for friendship. As she turned to leave, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in one of the cafeteria's polished surfaces. For a moment, she saw herself as the aliens must have seen her at first, a strange, soft-skinned creature from a world they could hardly imagine. But then she smiled, and in that smile was the warmth that had turned fear into fascination, strangers into friends. Humanity, fuck yeah, she murmured to herself, chuckling at the old internet meme that had somehow become her species' unofficial motto among the galactic community. But in her mind, she added a silent addendum. Humanity, Fuck yeah, not because we're the strongest or the toughest, but because we'll cross the stars to shake your hand or tentacle, or pseudopod and call you friend. With that thought warming her heart, Sarah Chen, human exchange student, accidental diplomat, and newly minted xenobiology tutor, because of course her alien friends had already roped her into helping them study, headed back to her dorm. Tomorrow was another day in this vast, weird, wonderful universe, and she couldn't wait to see what it would bring. Little did she know, as news of the friendly Deathworlder spread through the campus grapevine, which, in one memorable case, was an actual sentient grapevine, she had set in motion changes that would ripple across the galactic community. The story of the human who taught self-defense and made friends in equal measure would become legend, passed down through generations of students. And somewhere in the great cosmic bureaucracy that governed galactic affairs, a note was added to humanity's file. Approach with caution, not due to physical threat, but due to high risk of being drawn into long conversations, impromptu cultural exchanges, and unexpected friendships. Extreme empathy may be contagious. Class 12 designation reaffirmed: handle with care, respect, and an open mind. The universe, it seemed, would never be quite the same again. And that, as Sarah would say, was totally awesome.